Jerusalem burned like a torch in the hand of God. The morning sun rose through smoke, and what had been holy turned to ash. The streets were slick with blood, the air thick with iron. Crusaders knelt among the bodies, murmuring prayers through the stench. Bells tolled in triumph, but the sound carried no joy, only exhaustion, like heaven itself sighing. Out of the smoke, a child walked, barefoot, thin as a shadow, clutching a broken wooden cross to his chest. His face was streaked with dust and tears. Around him, men in armor stepped over corpses and whispered, Deus vult. God wills it. He stopped beside one of them, a knight kneeling in prayer, his hands red to the wrists. The boy looked at him for a long moment, then asked, Is he happy now? The knight froze. The words struck through his armor like arrows. He raised his head, met the child's eyes, and saw something unbearable. Innocence looking for God in a city that had just killed him again. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came. He turned away, weeping. The boy kept walking. His small feet left prints in the blood. He passed the ruins of houses, the burned market, the shattered gates. Everywhere the same silence, the same victory. He asked again to a passing soldier, Is he happy now? The soldier laughed once, then stopped, the sound dying in his throat. He looked down at his sword, still wet. Go home, he whispered. The boy shook his head. There is no home. He wandered on, the cross heavy in his arms. It had once hung in his mother's house, a simple carving of Christ. The top was broken, one arm charred. He held it the way a knight might hold a banner. The sun rose higher. Light spilled over the domes, catching on helmets and shields, turning the city into a mirror of gold and blood. Priests sang from the Holy Sepulchre, hymns of deliverance, of victory. But their voices trembled. The boy stood in the square, surrounded by grown men who had killed for God, and whispered to himself, He's not here. No one heard him. Or perhaps they did and could not bear to answer. Somewhere beyond the walls, the last cries of the dying faded. The wind carried ashes across the hills. The boy watched them drift and thought they looked like snow. He looked down at his cross. It was stained red now, its edges cracked. He wiped it with his sleeve, then pressed it to his chest. Don't look, he whispered, as if to Christ himself. Please don't look. Around him, Jerusalem, one, liberated, sanctified, smelled of sin. The narrator's voice, older, broken, remembering, rose over the scene. We took the city for heaven. We thought God had smiled. But that morning, even victory felt like blasphemy. The camera holds on the boy's face. Dust, tears, reflection of fire in his eyes, before the frame fades to black. Before the boy's question, there had been only noise. Years of marching, starving, believing. From the forests of France to the Levantine dust, they came beneath red crosses stitched by trembling hands. Princes and peasants walked the same road. Monks promised absolution as if it were bread. Mothers gave sons to banners brighter than reason. The rumor was simple: liberate Jerusalem and heaven will open. The echo grew louder than conscience, until even silence sounded like a command. At Clermont, Pope Urban lifted his hand and lit the spark. 3 words crossed Europe faster than drought or plague. God wills it. Men sold plows for spears, pawned winter bread for mail. Women wept and stitched crosses in doorways. Children learned a chant that tasted like iron. Priests preached that killing could cleanse. The road east became a river, and every step washed names from the feet that took it. 4 bitter years later, Jerusalem stood in heat like a held breath. Fatimid banners flickered on the ramparts. Inside lived Muslims, Jews, and Christians who had not chosen any army. Water was rationed. Hope hoarded. Outside waited the starving miracle, a host of iron bones. They cut down olive groves to feed towers. They prayed as arrows fell, their psalms braided with coughs, curses, and the thud of stones. On July 15th, the wall broke, ladders rose, fire leapt. Knights poured through the breach with mouths open like furnaces. They shouted the name until it had no meaning. Streets narrowed into traps, doorways became graves, and rooftops caved into red courtyards. For 2 days the city howled. Then the noise died, leaving a ringing that felt like accusation. They called it victory. Priests washed altars with tears and blood, sang deliverance, raised the cross above a floor that sucked at their sandals. Chroniclers sharpened quills and fashioned glories from smoke. But among them walked a child no page would keep. He carried a broken cross from a broken house and searched faces as if they were doors. Each door opened on silence. He was Christian by birth and orphan by siege. His father had vanished in the first breach. His mother fell in a courtyard where prayers and screams braided into one rope. He hid beneath a cart and mouthed words he barely knew. When the flames cooled, he rose and took the cross from the wall. It cracked in his hands, a small Calvary splintered by conquest. He thought if he kept it close, God would find him. Instead, he found men who would not meet his eyes. Knights rinsed blades in cisterns and called the water holy. A monk laid his palm on a corpse and whispered thanks for victory, then saw the boy and forgot his Latin. The child asked, "Is he happy now?" The question climbed the walls and vanished among the banners. No one answered, because any answer would have broken the story they needed to live. Later, the chronicles would polish the day until it shone. They would count relics, not children. They would measure the distance between prophecy and dust, and still call it divine. But the city remembered differently. The stones kept the prints of small feet. The gutters kept the rust where a wooden cross had rested. The wind kept a question and carried it to every dome. Is he happy now? The narrator returns, older and quieter, a knight speaking to the dark. We wanted a miracle we could touch. We wanted to force heaven open. Instead, we opened the earth. The boy's cross was the truest relic that day, because it was broken and still believed. If faith has any honor left, it is the honor of answering a child. We could not, and for that, our victory felt like blasphemy. The camera lingers on the child in the square, the broken cross against his heart, while bells ring like distant apologies no mouth can speak. They said they were God's army. They had marched from the edges of the world, through famine, through betrayal, through cities that burned because they would not believe fast enough. And now, at last, they knelt in the city of God, and found their hands too red to fold. In the shadow of the Holy Sepulchre, the Crusaders gathered, helmets dented, armor scorched, eyes hollow. Their lips moved in prayer, but their fingers still trembled from killing. Blood dried on their palms, black under the glow of candles. One knight dipped his hands in holy water. The water darkened, then stilled. He looked down, and for the first time in years, saw the stain he could not wash. They called this place salvation. Yet their prayers smelled of iron. Brother Anselm, the knight who would later meet the boy, knelt apart from the others. He stared at the crucifix above the altar, its Christ blackened by smoke. "We have delivered your city," he whispered. "But who will deliver us?" The silence after his words was colder than any winter he had known. Outside, the victors paraded relics through the streets. Fragments of bone, torn banners, candles salvaged from ruined chapels. They sang psalms of triumph, but their voices cracked. The people they had slaughtered lay piled in doorways, their prayers unfinished. Jerusalem had been won for heaven, yet heaven felt further than ever. The boy wandered among them, small, barefoot, his wooden cross clutched like a relic of his own making. He stopped before a group of knights as they chanted Te Deum Laudamus. Their leader, tall and grim, raised his sword and cried, "This blood is proof of faith." The boy looked up at him, unblinking, and said softly, "Then faith must hurt him." The singing faltered. No one spoke. The boy walked away. Brother Anselm followed with his eyes. The sight of the child stirred something long buried, a memory of his own son, left behind in Normandy, too young to understand why his father had gone to war for God. He remembered the promise he had made. "When I return, it will be to a world made holy." Now he saw that world lying broken before him. He rose and stepped outside. The city reeked of smoke and sanctity. Soldiers knelt beside corpses, whispering thanks. Some washed their swords and called it baptism. A few stood motionless, staring at the ruins as if waiting for an answer that never came. Anselm walked until he reached the courtyard of a burned synagogue. The air shimmered with heat. Inside, the walls were scorched with handprints, marks left by those who had sought refuge and found none. He pressed his own hand beside them. The ash clung to his skin. He thought of all the sermons that had promised glory, of every priest who had said, "God will know his own." He wondered now if God had known any of them at all. Behind him, the boy appeared again. He stood in the doorway, watching the night in silence. "Why do you cry?" the boy asked. Anselm turned. "Because we found the city of God," he said, "and lost ourselves in it." The boy nodded, as if he had expected that answer. He held up his cross, the wood cracked but still upright. "I think he dropped this," he said simply. "Maybe you can give it back to him." The knight took the cross, feeling its weight, light yet unbearable. He knelt and placed it on the ground between them. For the first time since the siege began, he prayed, not for victory, not for forgiveness, but for silence. When he opened his eyes, the boy was gone. The wind passed through the ruins, carrying dust and ashes through the open door. The cross lay at his feet, its shadow long and trembling in the light. Anselm bowed his head. "We have taken the city," he murmured, "but heaven has taken us." The bells rang again, hollow and distant. The prayers of soldiers echoed off the walls, colliding with the cries of the dead. And above them all, a child's question drifted through the smoke. "Is he happy now?" No one answered. No one ever would. Jerusalem did not fall quietly. The fires had dimmed, but under every stone, something still burned. From the alleys came voices in languages the victors did not know: Arabic, Hebrew, Coptic, soft, broken prayers rising through dust. Beneath collapsed houses, people whispered not to be heard by the living, but by God. The boy wandered toward those sounds. He had seen too much silence from the conquerors. Now he sought it from the conquered. The wind carried ash through the broken windows of a mosque. Inside, the air was heavy with incense and soot. A woman's voice trembled from behind a wall, reciting the 99th name of God. The boy stood still, his wooden cross pressed to his chest. He did not understand her words, but he understood the rhythm, the breath between them, the trembling hope that someone might still be listening. He knelt where he stood and whispered the only prayer he remembered: "Our Father, who art in heaven." His Latin stumbled, his voice cracked, but the cadence of her Arabic prayer and his own blended in the smoke. Two faiths, two fires, one silence. Brother Anselm found him there at dusk. The boy was kneeling in the ruins, his small body half lit by dying sunlight, half shadowed by the smoke. "What are you doing here?" the knight asked softly. The boy turned. "Listening." "To what?" "To God trying to breathe." Anselm looked around the ruined mosque. The walls were cracked but still stood. A verse in Arabic wound around the dome, scorched yet legible. He couldn't read it, but he felt its weight, words of mercy written in a place men had destroyed in his name. In the corner, a wounded man stirred. His face was gray with dust, his eyes open but calm. He looked at the Crusader and the boy without fear. His lips moved. The knight knelt beside him. "What is he saying?" the boy asked. Anselm shook his head. The man reached for the boy's cross. For a moment Anselm tensed. The old reflex, the old divide. But the man only touched it gently, tracing the broken edge with a bloodied finger. Then he smiled. The boy whispered, "He knows him too." The man's voice was faint. "Allah, Rahman, Rahim." Anselm had heard those words on the battlefield, shouted by dying enemies. Now, spoken here, they sounded like forgiveness. "He is merciful," Anselm murmured, repeating the phrase as best he could. The man's eyes closed. They sat beside him until the light faded completely. The boy finally said, "If he prayed to his God and we to ours, maybe they spoke to each other." Anselm said nothing. He felt the air change, cooler, gentler, as if the smoke itself had exhaled. When they stepped outside, the streets were almost quiet. The fires had eaten all they could. The city smelled of dust, oil, and old sorrow. From the minaret, a single bell clanged weakly in the wind, once used to call men to prayer, now tolling for the dead. The boy asked, "Did we win?" Anselm stopped walking. The word win sounded obscene. He looked at the child, at the cross, at the crimson sky, and said, "We ended something. I don't know what we began." They stood on a hill overlooking the city. Smoke curled like ghostly script over the domes. Somewhere below, survivors carried their wounded into the dark. Somewhere else, Crusaders sang victory hymns, their torches bright as sins they didn't yet regret. Anselm listened to both, the hymn and the lament, and felt torn between them. The same rhythm, the same longing. One called it triumph, the other grief. Both sounded like confession. He whispered, "Maybe there is only one prayer, and we keep saying it wrong." The boy nodded, holding the broken cross higher, its shadow crossing the red sky. The narrator's voice returns, older, trembling. "The chronicles wrote of swords, of relics of glory, but beneath the smoke, faith prayed in two languages, and heaven, too weary to choose, listened in silence. By the third night, Jerusalem no longer groaned. The wind passed through its streets like a slow prayer, carrying ashes where songs used to be. Smoke rose from the temple roofs in pale columns, curling into the dusk like hands asking for something that would never return. The battle was over, but the silence that followed was heavier than the war itself. The boy walked through that silence, barefoot, clutching his cross. His small feet slapped against the stones still warm from fire. The bodies had been cleared, but the stains remained, dark shapes on pale stone, too large to belong to any shadow. He passed the empty fountain at the market, where water once blessed the living. Now it was filled with nothing but sky. Brother Anselm followed him at a distance. He could not bring himself to speak. The boy had not cried, not once. He simply walked as if looking for something he refused to name. The knight watched him stop beside the ruined steps of a church. The boy knelt, tracing a crack in the marble with his finger. "Is this where he was?" he asked. Anselm knelt beside him. "Who?" "God." The knight looked at the stone floor. He could still smell blood beneath the incense. "He was here," he said quietly. "But I don't know if he stayed." The boy's gaze lifted toward the dome. A beam of light pierced the smoke above, thin as breath. "Do you think he saw?" Anselm hesitated. "If he did," he said, "perhaps that's why he's silent." The boy frowned. "Silent? I thought he'd sing." The knight smiled sadly. "He used to." They sat in that broken church until the bells rang for vespers. The Crusaders' voices echoed outside, prayers of thanksgiving shouted by men who had killed enough to feel forgiven. The boy listened, his small face blank. "They sound happy," he said. "Maybe they are. But he isn't." The words cut through the air like a blade. Anselm looked at him. The child was staring at the altar, blackened by smoke, cracked by heat. The carved Christ above it had no face anymore, only the outline of pain. The boy stood and whispered, "If he's up there, he should come down." The knight closed his eyes. Maybe he did. The boy turned toward the doorway. Through it, the light outside shimmered red, dust floating in the air like slow snow. He stepped into it, holding the cross in both hands. "He should have stopped it," he said. Anselm followed, voice hoarse. "Maybe he tried." The boy stopped. "Then he failed." The knight had no answer. He had spent 4 years crossing continents for faith. But now, standing before a child with a question, every sermon felt like blasphemy. The bells stopped. The last echo faded into wind. A single feather drifted from the rafters, white, scorched at the tip. The boy reached out and caught it. "Look," he whispered. "Maybe he left this." Anselm looked up at the empty ceiling. "No angels came," he said. "Only us." The boy held the feather tight. "Then maybe we're supposed to be them." The knight exhaled, trembling. "If that's true," he said, "we've forgotten how." He looked around at the city they had conquered, the towers, the domes, the dying light, and for the first time saw it not as a prize, but as a wound. The narrator's voice returns, older, distant, filled with regret. "We said heaven was silent, but perhaps it was not silence, only sorrow. For even angels must turn away when men mistake devotion for destruction." The boy placed the feather at the foot of the cracked altar, then turned and walked out into the twilight. The knight followed him, both barefoot now, their steps the same small sound on the stones. At dawn, the wind carried the smell of burnt cedar. The city was quiet, but not peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that follows a scream. The Crusaders slept in the courtyards of their victory, swords laid beside them like relics. Over the Holy Sepulchre, smoke still curled like incense from a funeral that had no priest. The boy walked through it, alone, his cross dragging behind him, leaving faint lines in the ash. He stopped beside the body of a woman, his mother. Her hair was matted with dust, her eyes half open toward heaven. The child sat beside her and spoke softly, as if not to wake her. "They said it would be beautiful," he whispered. "They said he would come." He placed the cross on her chest and waited for breath that never came. Brother Anselm found him there. He had been searching since nightfall, afraid the boy had disappeared among the dead. The sight froze him. The child, the woman, the broken cross. 3 shapes that looked too holy for this world. He approached slowly, his armor creaking like confession. "Come," he said gently. "You can't stay here." The boy looked up. His voice was calm. "Are you the angel they promised?" Anselm stopped. His throat closed. For years he had killed men for less than that question. But now it felt like judgment. He took off his helmet and set it on the ground. "No," he said. "Not an angel." The boy tilted his head. "Then why are you crying?" The knight knelt beside him. "Because I was supposed to bring God here," he said. "And I think I brought something else." The boy nodded slowly, as if understanding what many grown men never would. "It's okay," he said. "You can sit with us." Anselm sat. Together they watched the dawn rise over the city. Sunlight touched the domes, the broken walls, the fields of armor gleaming like bones. Bells began to ring again, hollow, jubilant, false. The knight flinched. The boy turned to him. "They said he's happy now." "Is that true?" Anselm could not answer. His voice cracked, the words falling apart before they reached his lips. "I don't know anymore." He stared at his hands. They shook, still red beneath the grime. "I prayed to be his soldier," he whispered. "But soldiers don't know how to love." The boy picked up his cross. The wood splintered but still whole, and pressed it into the knight's hands. "Then maybe now you do." Anselm closed his fingers around it. The wood was warm, alive. He bowed his head and for the first time prayed without words. Behind them, the streets filled with voices. Crusaders celebrating, priests chanting, pilgrims weeping. The sound rolled over the city like thunder, drowning out the silence they had found. Anselm looked at the boy. "Come," he said. "I'll take you somewhere safe." He lifted the child in his arms. The cross hung between them, its weight greater than any sword. He carried him through the ruins, past the wounded, past the fires. Men looked at him and saw a knight carrying a child. None dared speak. At the gate of the convent he stopped. The church had burned, its door half collapsed. Inside, the candles had melted into pools of wax, the air heavy with the scent of death. He laid the boy near the altar, where light from the shattered window fell in long golden lines. "Rest here," he said. "I'll find water." The boy caught his sleeve. "Will he come back?" Anselm met his gaze. "Maybe. He never left." He stepped back into the courtyard, where the sun had risen fully. The city glowed like a wound cauterized by light. He fell to his knees, the cross still in his hand. "We took the holy city," he whispered. "But you took my heart." For a long time he stayed like that, armor glinting, face wet, the boy's question echoing in his mind. "Are you happy now?" And somewhere in that silence, a single tear fell from heaven, too small to see, too late to stop the fire, but enough to cool one's soul. The city had been taken, the banners raised, the songs written, but peace never came. Jerusalem, the prize of prophecy, lay quiet as a tomb. The Crusaders called it redemption, yet every courtyard smelled of guilt. The priests chanted psalms of deliverance, but the echoes of slaughter carried louder than their hymns. Even the bells sounded tired, as though they too doubted what they were meant to celebrate. Brother Anselm stayed behind, far from the parades of glory. He lived among the wounded and the orphans in a small cloister near the ruined convent. His sword hung above the doorway, rusted, untouched. He no longer called it holy. Each morning, he cleaned the chapel steps, washed blood from stone, and prayed to a silence that had stopped answering long ago. And each morning the boy came to sit beside him, watching without speaking, clutching his repaired wooden cross. It was crooked now, bound with strips of cloth, but it stood upright in his hands like defiance. The other knights called Anselm mad. "You pity what God condemned," they said. He did not argue. He simply looked at the boy and saw the only truth left in the city, that innocence had survived, though barely. At night, the boy would ask questions that cracked his heart open. Did we save it? Did we make him proud? When does heaven stop crying? Anselm answered as best he could. Maybe it doesn't. One evening, after Mass, he found himself standing alone before the altar of the Holy Sepulchre. Hundreds of candles flickered, their smoke twisting like ghosts. Pilgrims knelt in joy, kissing the stones, believing themselves cleansed. He wanted to believe, too. But all he saw was blood still wet between the cracks. He left the church before dawn and walked to the Mount of Olives. The boy followed, barefoot and silent. From there they could see the whole city, the domes glinting under the pale light, the streets still scarred. Anselm knelt in the dust. "This is what we won," he said. The boy placed the cross in the ground beside him. "Then why does it look sad?" Anselm smiled weakly. "Because we took it by forgetting why it was holy." The wind rose, carrying the sound of bells from the west. They rang for victory, but the note was wrong. Sharp, hollow, like a cry held too long. The boy listened, eyes wide. "They're shouting too loud," he said. "Maybe heaven can't hear them." The knight closed his eyes. "Maybe heaven doesn't want to." He thought of the men who had marched beside him, of the promises they'd believed. He remembered how faith had once sounded like courage, then like thunder, then finally like regret. He had come to Jerusalem to find God's face, and found instead his own reflection, tired, scarred, human. He looked at the boy. "You'll leave someday," he said softly. "You'll go where no one remembers this." The child frowned. "And you?" "I'll stay," Anselm said. "Someone has to remember." He touched the broken cross in the sand. "This is the only relic worth keeping, not the sword, not the banner. This." The boy nodded. "Then it's his city again?" The knight smiled through tears. "It will be when mercy lives here." They sat together until the sun rose. The light fell on their faces, warm, unearned. The city below shimmered as if washed clean, though they both knew it was not. When they returned to the convent, the streets were already filling with pilgrims. The boy looked back once. "It's beautiful," he said. Anselm shook his head. "No, it's forgiven." The narrator's voice returns, old and weary. "The chronicles called it a triumph, but to those who stayed it felt like penance. We carried the cross through blood and found that victory weighed more than sin." And as the bells of Jerusalem rang again, the boy's question still floated in the air. "Is he happy now?" No one answered. But this time, no one pretended to know. Years passed. The city changed its flags, its rulers, its names, but the blood never fully left the stones. Pilgrims came, walked barefoot through the holy streets, kissed the walls, whispered forgiveness to a sky that still smelled faintly of fire. And beneath one of those walls, half buried in sand, a small wooden cross remained, split, weathered, and silent. It was the boy's, the same cross that had survived the siege, that had rested on his mother's chest, that had been held by the knight who couldn't pray. The wood had darkened with time, the cloth binding had turned to threads, but it still stood upright where he had left it. Brother Anselm had grown old. His armor lay rusting somewhere under the convent, his sword forgotten, his faith slower, softer. He no longer preached to soldiers or blessed banners. He tended gardens, mended roofs, taught orphans to read their prayers. When pilgrims asked him what miracle he had seen when Jerusalem was taken, he answered quietly that anyone could still believe. He never spoke of the boy. The memory was too holy to name. But every evening before sunset, he would walk to the edge of the city and kneel beside the little cross. Sometimes he prayed aloud. Sometimes he only listened. Once he thought he heard a child's voice answer back, faint, like wind through reeds. The others called it imagination. He called it mercy, remembering its way home. On the anniversary of the siege, the Crusaders held a grand procession. Banners of silk, relics of bone, the holy lance raised high. Anselm stood at the edge of the crowd. The people cheered, the priests sang, the city glowed. And yet, among the relics, he saw none that felt true. He thought of the little wooden cross outside the walls and smiled, unseen. After the ceremony, he returned to the spot where the boy had buried it. The sun was setting, gold bleeding into crimson. He touched the cross gently. It wobbled in the wind, but did not fall. "You've stood longer than any of us," he whispered. "Perhaps you're the only one who still prays right." He dug a small hollow beside it and placed something inside. A piece of parchment, folded and sealed. On it, a single line. Even victory felt like blasphemy. Then he covered it with earth. That night a storm came. Rain swept through the city, washing dust from roofs, soot from stones. Lightning flashed over the dome. Thunder rolled over the hills. When morning came, the cross still stood, its surface polished by rain, shining faintly in the dawn light. Years later, travelers found it and thought it a forgotten relic. Some claimed it was from the true cross. Others said it was a child's toy. The truth was smaller, humbler, and therefore holier. Because faith had cracked there, and yet not broken. In the chapel, old Anselm lay dying. The same dawn filtered through the window, pale and gold. He felt the light on his face, and whispered the boy's question one last time. "Is he happy now?" No answer came, only the wind. But the sound of it was gentle, almost like laughter through tears. He smiled, closed his eyes, and slipped away. Outside, the wind bent the little cross in the sand, then let it stand again. Centuries would bury it deeper, but not its meaning. When archaeologists uncovered it long after, they found it bound with rusted wire, half turned to dust. Inside the hollow beneath, they found the faded parchment, words barely legible. "Heaven is silent, but mercy speaks." And even if no one believed the story, the relic remained. A cross that broke but would not fall. A faith that bled but would not die. The chronicles said Jerusalem was redeemed. They wrote it in Latin so polished it gleamed like the gold of the dome itself. They counted relics, weighed miracles, numbered martyrs. They told of knights kneeling in triumph, of priests weeping with joy, of banners rising over God's city as the angels sang. But the stones told another story. Those who stayed behind remembered the smell, the sound, the silence. They remembered how the prayers of victors sounded like apologies, and how the tears of children were holier than all their hymns. No scribe wrote those memories. No pope canonized them. They lingered in the dust, in the faint scratches on the convent walls, in the whisper that sometimes crossed the wind. Is he happy now? Brother Anselm's name was forgotten. The boy's was never known. Yet both had seen the truth that the banners hid, that faith had come to prove itself, and left ashamed. Jerusalem was taken for God, but what returned to him was not a city, only a question. The old knight's final words were written on a single line, buried beside the broken cross. Even victory felt like blasphemy. Scholars centuries later would debate its meaning. Some called it heresy, others confession. But for those who still listened, it was neither. It was the sound of a soul remembering that God cannot be conquered. The city was rebuilt, the blood dried, the relics turned to dust. But sometimes, in the quiet hour before dawn, the bells of Jerusalem ring off key, as if struck by trembling hands. Those who live there say it is the wind. Those who pray there know better. The bells echo through the narrow streets, over domes and rooftops, past churches and mosques. They mingle with the call to prayer, with footsteps in the alleys, with the heartbeat of a world still divided by the same name. In that mingling, something ancient survives, the ache of faith, learning humility. The camera moves through the city as it is now. Monks walking side by side with imams, children chasing pigeons where the blood once flowed. The voice of the narrator, aged and breaking, speaks one last time. They said we freed the tomb of Christ, but perhaps he never left it. Perhaps he stayed buried, waiting for us to learn that holiness is not taken, only given. We won a city, but lost heaven's favor. We silenced the enemy and found ourselves unheard. He pauses, as if praying through regret. If faith means to follow light, then that child carried more faith than all our armies. He walked through the blood of Jerusalem and asked the only question worth asking. Is he happy now? The wind stirs. The bells fade. The camera lingers on the horizon. Jerusalem in gold, the desert in gray, the line between them as thin as breath. No angels came that day, only a boy with a broken cross, and through him heaven spoke again. The screen darkens, leaving only the sound of footsteps, small, slow, fading into silence. Jerusalem endures. Empires rise, empires fall, and still the stones remain. Pale, cracked, patient. Pilgrims walk its streets, as if retracing an apology that never ends. The air carries every prayer ever spoken here, every cry that mistook pain for praise. The wind still smells faintly of ash when it rains. The boy's question lingers, older now, spoken by new mouths in new wars. Is he happy now? They ask it under different flags in different tongues. The silence that answers them is the same one that fell over the city in 1099. It is the sound of heaven waiting for mercy to speak first. If you walk through Jerusalem at dawn, when the bells begin before the muezzins, you will hear the two sounds crossing, one rising, one falling, neither conquering the other. Between them, a rhythm forms, quiet and fragile, like breath shared between strangers. That is what forgiveness sounds like. Some say the cross is gone, swallowed by centuries. Others say it still stands somewhere near the old walls, buried under layers of dust and devotion. Perhaps it doesn't matter. What endures is not the wood, but the question it carried. The question that no king, no army, no prophet has ever answered without trembling. What does God want from us? Victory or mercy? The narrator's voice, old and raw, returns for the last time. We marched for salvation and found only ourselves. We mistook our anger for faith, our conquest for devotion. But that boy, he walked through the blood of Jerusalem and showed us what holiness truly costs. It is not glory, it is grief, not triumph, but tenderness. The camera moves through modern Jerusalem. A Muslim man opens his shop as a church bell rings. A priest shares bread with a child who sells figs in the street. Two children, one with a Star of David, one with a cross, laugh as pigeons scatter into the light. The wind lifts dust from the stones. It glows like gold before fading into the air. If faith still bleeds, the narrator whispers, let mercy be the bandage. If heaven is silent, let us be its voice. If victory felt like blasphemy, then let forgiveness be our prayer. The last shot lingers on the horizon. The same city, the same light, the same endless question carried by the wind. Faith does not need to win. It only needs to survive. The bells and the call to prayer merge one final time. The sound becomes one continuous note, rising, dissolving, infinite. If mercy survived the Crusades, the voice fades. It can survive us. Fade to black.